For all those reasons, Of Ants and Dinosaurs is an excellent novel, a very short one, very entertaining one. It reads extremely easily. There are plenty of ideas, and depending on... Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Today, a Chinese science fiction novel by somebody you may have heard of, Cixin Liu, Of Ants and Dinosaurs. Of course, I apologize for the pronunciation of the Chinese name, but I'm sure you can read it on screen. Now, Cixin Liu became rather famous all of a sudden thanks to his trilogy, the Three-Body Problem trilogy, started in 2006 and the last volume in 2010. And of course, you may be aware that there was a Netflix adaptation made. In fact, I think that the second season coming soon. The trilogy itself in book form has 3 volumes, of course, it's a trilogy. Cixin Liu is also part of this movement, really, of Asian, and in this case, more specifically, probably Chinese science fiction, that has seen quite a few novels published lately, let's say, not only by Chinese as it were, but also some Chinese Americans. And it's good for all of us who do not live in Asia to be reminded from time to time that indeed, of course, Asia has its own science fiction literature, fantastic literature, and I can only really encourage you to go and have a look at them. It depends a little bit on whether they've been translated in your language. I read in French and in English, and that gives me quite a large array, but I have to say that some of those that I read in French because they were never translated in English. Of course, you can always go back to Kobo Abe, the great Japanese science fiction writer, and I guess science fiction here, it opens a can of worms. Is it science fiction? Is it fantastic fantasy? It's very hard to say, of course. I also know science fiction from Malaysia, from Japan, of course, from Thailand, and I'm sure I know there is a lot more to discover. Now, what is the summary very quickly of Ants and Dinosaurs, published in 2010? It's a very, very simple story in a way. Long ago in the past, ants and dinosaurs evolved in such a way as to gain, let's say, access to self-consciousness. And they are going to co-evolve, cognitively speaking, not necessarily physically, they won't change physically, but in terms of cognition, in terms of, again, self-consciousness, awareness of oneself. They will start cooperating to develop basically a great ant and dinosaur and ant civilization that will extend very far and that will count, well, literally billions of members, of course, because there are many more ants than there are dinosaurs by virtue of biology. It is almost a novella, I guess you could call it a novella. It's very short indeed. And I will not spoil the ending, of course, for you, but what it really reads at when you read that book is both as a young adult novel, which it isn't, I don't think, and as a metaphor, as an analogy that we have to, of course, draw on and try to relate to something and make sense of. Now, the first thing is that indeed it reads a little bit, of course in its English translation, I hasten to say, it reads a bit like a young adult. It is written in a very sort of simple way, as it were. There are very few pyrotechnics, stylistically speaking. Let's say, sentence construction, the vocabulary used, all this is really easily accessible, very easily accessible, I would argue. And the narrative itself develops in a sort of very simple, let me tell you what happened way. Not everything is told, of course, and if you are a biologist or somebody seriously interested in the theory of evolution, you will probably balk a little bit at some of the gaps that are left in a narrative, but that's fine because the narrative is not designed to be a scientific explanation of something. It is basically a speculation on what if something that happened millions of years in the past, not involving us, but involving other species, with a very different type of, let's say, brain, if you can call it brain, of course, for the ants. Also a very different kind of social organization. In other words, two very different cultures, civilizations, groups of beings. That's really what it is. And despite, again, being very, very different from one another, both physiologically and cognitively, they both manage to work with the other and symbiotically, as it were, almost, develop a great civilization. And again, it is told in a very sort of, I wouldn't say childlike way, but it is like a fable. A very simple fable through which you try to relate some ideas, of course. Now, that is very interesting from the point of view of science fiction writing, or writing in general probably, which is that sometimes you can also take a completely outrageous idea, and of course, in science fiction, there's been, many of those examples, in a sense of an idea that is not really plausible. The first thing you would have to ask, of course, is where are the remnants of that great civilization that covered the earth? But all those things notwithstanding, it remains, of course, an outrageous idea. But you can make it work if, of course, you don't tell it for the fun of telling it simply, but because you are trying to do something with it. And that's where the fable element, the metaphorical element, comes into it, because very often texts for young adults or children are loaded with, moral injunctions, be good, do good, respect your family, don't steal. All those things are very often built in children's literature and young adult literature, really. But certainly children's literature, children's magazine. And of course you don't have a character saying it out loud, do good, respect your parents. But that is certainly what will happen between two characters in a story you're reading. And as a child you may not, of course, identify that level of meaning, but it will still be lodged in your brain somewhere. That is the power of reading, of course. So here, really, Cixin Liu takes an outrageous idea, but he makes it stick because he tries to remain as scientific as possible. He tries to remain as logical as possible. So the story is not some sort of crazy invention that has great holes in it because nothing of that would work. No, it really is very well worked out, very well explained. Okay, we can discuss the details, I'm sure, but nevertheless it works. It's really good construction of the story, as it were, and the integration of the scientific ideas in it. So this is something that Sarah Mandelson, in her wonderful book on science fiction, it's a non-fiction book on science fiction, the Intergalactic Playground, remarks on also when she analyzes hundreds of young adult science fiction novels. If you want to have an idea of what to read, you don't know what to read, you're interested in young adults and science fiction stuff, you should have a look at her bibliography. It's great for that. And that's what she identifies indeed, is that you can have sometimes incredible ideas, but those ideas are trying to carry something, usually a social theme, but it doesn't have to be. Now, basically what we realize when we read a text like this is that very quickly, as adults, as it were, as fully conscious adults, we can see something happening here, which is that we can affix, we can give sort of human characteristics to both civilizations, the ants and the dinosaurs. And we realize, of course, very quickly that both groups replicate, imitate human behavior. I don't mean eating or drinking. There's very little space for all those details. He's not really interested in that at all. I mean in terms of thinking about the other, thinking about one's place in the world, ambition, envy, resentment, anger, all those things come into it. Therefore, that's where it becomes, of course, even more of a fable, a metaphor, at text level, as it were. So here, for example, what happens is that in the beginning, both sides see that there is potentially a benefit to both of them in cooperating. So they cooperate very well. Now, of course, they have great differences between them. Some are very strong. The dinosaurs can do a lot of things physically, as it were, even though some of them are limited by their limbs. And the ants are capable of bringing together billions of brains, as it were, to create some sort of meta-intelligence. And so it can achieve a whole lot of discoveries, technological innovations, etc., etc., etc. And so both sides see very well that there is benefit to both of them. Now, what is very interesting here, of course, is to think a little bit further and quite simply ask ourselves what kind of animals are the ants and the dinosaurs in real life, as it were. And the ants, of course, are a social, so-called animal, living in great numbers with some sort of hierarchical division, a specialization of roles, of course, led by one person. And the dinosaurs, well, the dinosaurs are much more a solitary type of animals, at least the carnivorous one, the predating or predator, the T-Rex-like predators, for example. And so here, if we think that it is a fable or it is a metaphor, well, if those animals are like this in the real world, how do they conduct themselves in a novel? And of course, that is reflected in a novel. But we can see also that there is here perhaps a nod towards different ways of organizing one's culture or seeing oneself as a culture. Do you see yourself as a collective culture or as a very individualistic one? The ants in a novel are very collective thinking. They do things together to protect the whole. The dinosaurs are much more individualistic, much more aggressive, much more warlike, much more acquisitive. They want more. Much less caring about the environment. In other words, a very different type of thinking about society and how to live together and how to organize oneself together. It is therefore a very, very, very small step to take to then try to relate that to human societies. And it is, of course, evident, I think, at least culturally, that the Chinese historically tend to be a much more collective culture than, for example, let's say, America, which prides itself on individualism and self-development, as it were. Now, the novel, again, you have to read it, and you have to read it to the end. It's extremely entertaining. It doesn't take very long. And honestly, I think it could be used at schools. For at least two reasons why the sort of scientific introduction, the very soft, very well narrated introduction into, let's say, Darwinism and Darwinian theory, the theory of evolution, and at the same time, a sort of 2-3-tier, 3-layered sort of meaningful text that can keep it at the level of the narrative and the ideas in it, that can take it in the direction of animal societies or societies in a very objective, different sort of, global way, or again, relating it specifically to human cultures and societies that we know. That's the last point that I wanted to just say a word about it, with great caveat as well that I am in no way well read in either Chinese literature or certainly Chinese science fiction. But it did occur to me that I read recently another Cixin Liu novel, the Supernova Era, I think it's called. I'm not sure about the title anymore, but I'm sure I'll be able to put it on screen. Really, honestly, a very, very good novel. Science fiction novel where, I think it's a comet or something, basically all the adults die. So the world now is only populated by children. I think up to the age of 15 or something like that. I can't quite remember. And so what happens when the world is suddenly populated by children? Well, what happens is very interesting because here Cixin Liu takes into account the countries around the world that are, suffering from the same problem. And so he's got some chapters on China, what happens in China and the Chinese children, how do they organize themselves, how do they survive the ordeal of finding themselves defenseless, without any adults around to run the machines, to make the factories go, to produce, to fabricate, to fly planes, to drive cars. Of course, none of this can be done anymore. So there are chapters about the Chinese, but there are also chapters about the Americans and some Europeans. Because ultimately there will be some sort of world summit, which will basically pitch the Americans against the Chinese. Reading of Ants and Dinosaurs, after having read Supernova, I was struck by the fact that there perhaps was a very sort of almost patriotic element in those novels, in the sense that the Chinese, in Supernova era, the Chinese children are not necessarily described as perfect and better than the others, by all means. In fact, they seem to be afflicted with some sort of giving up sort of disease, but at the same time they do work as a group. What is remarkable in that novel is that the American children immediately take weapons and start killing one another. That is, children find the pleasure in going to all those stores when you can buy a weapon, or in that case, of course, just take it because no adult is around anymore. And then they start organizing war games in America. So America becomes some sort of war game country where everybody carries weapons and kills just on sight. Isn't that interesting? Considering, of course, the opposition between the dinosaurs, highly individualistic, highly acquisitive, highly, let's say, feeling-based, angered, bullies. Well, that's what they are, really. And the ants, collective, protecting both the environment and themselves, and not reflecting at all those values that in so much of, for example, American science fiction, 70s, 80s certainly, very sort of America is strong type of approach. So I thought that was very interesting because that's now 2 novels by Cixin Liu that I read. I read The Three-Body Problem. It is a different kind of beast, of course, but those 2 I thought were really interesting, if only for that. I am not at all certain it is the case, of course, but I can't help but be struck by the fact that in both cases, both excellent novels in their own right, it can be read also metaphorically as a nod towards how to best organize one's civilization, one's society, and are there cultural traits that are so obvious that when they are represented in the book, those groups, they immediately reflect what perhaps Chinese people think about Americans or Europeans or South Americans or Africans, whatever is the case, of course. The queen bee being the sole leader, the queen ant being the sole leader, of course the dinosaurs are fragmented. All those perhaps hint towards also a social, societal, cultural, political reading of those 2 novels. So, for all those reasons, Of Ants and Dinosaurs is an excellent novel, a very short one, very entertaining one. It reads extremely easily. There are plenty of ideas, and depending on your level of attention or desire, of course, you, in fact, may bring in a lot of interpretations in that book, which I think invites most of them, if not all of them. Thank you.